The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents, what sacrifice did Jesus actually make? Well, for the sake of this video, we're going to be assuming that the mythicists are wrong and that Jesus existed in some sense, and that while we may not know exactly what happened or which parts of the biblical account are accurate or not, we're just going to look at the story. Because Christianity has built a tradition talking about the incredible sacrifice made by Jesus. It is this entire, I remember growing up and you were made to feel like God, you were so awful that God had to come down himself and sacrifice himself to save you. That there was no other way to do this, no other way to forgive you for being awful from before you were born or the moment you were born, without this particular sacrifice. He's likened to the Lamb of God. He's supposedly the ultimate sacrifice, slaughtered and resurrected for our salvation. And Christians wear and hang crosses everywhere. You can hardly turn on a porn video anymore without somebody with a cross necklace sitting there telling you that, yes, I like doing porn and I love me some Jesus. It hangs in most churches, sometimes with a figure on it in the sense of a crucifix, more Catholic oriented, and usually just, there's the cross. I'm not going to be going into the details of crucifixion today. We may do a video on that another time, but this is the critical foundation. I mean, even Paul pointed out that if Christ be not raised, which he can't be raised if there wasn't something to raise him from. So this whole thing about the death and resurrection of Jesus is the most important thing in all of Christendom. It's the reason why most everybody will celebrate Christmas, but Easter is the holiday that really matters within Christianity. I suppose it's nice if you're a believer that Jesus was born, although weirdly claiming he was born of a virgin is worth a video on its own. In the Old Testament, the Jews would have to do ritual sacrifices. And the way it's described in the Bible has God being pleased by the smell of burning flesh and the smell of the blood. This is very simply, I know people are going to be insulted that I phrase it this way, but it's Jewish blood magic. That's what's happening in sacrifices. Other pagans, all the people worshiping Moloch and all those others, they would occasionally do human sacrifices, but the Jews largely eschewed human sacrifices and would instead sacrifice a lamb, etc. And there were specific requirements about what sort of, it had to be unblemished and all these other things for the various ritualistic blood magic. Now, at some point, we stopped doing that. For a number of reasons. Some will claim that it's theological and even biblical about when this stopped. I don't necessarily see the justification for it, but I'm happy that we're not running around habitually killing and burning animals to please somebody who evidently isn't there. But when you take a look at the life of Jesus, I have a number of objections that don't have anything to do with the death, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. He seemed like someone who, if we were to believe the stories, contributed nothing to society. He wandered around as an adult with a bunch of disciples, ostensibly living off of other people and their food, despite the fact that he could supposedly magically create or multiply food, which can't be proven. And supposedly he performed a bunch of miracles that amount to absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things, because we're told that everything about this world is like dirty rags, and it's this is the place where you wipe your feet before you go on to the real afterlife. There's nothing about human existence that is in any way valued in the Bible as anything other than a means to get to heaven or hell. He was then crucified. He was crucified for heresy, and I'll touch a little bit more on, if you go watch the Passion of the Christ depiction, you can get a full torture porn version of that. And what you see in that depiction of the crucifixion while it's largely biblically accurate, is what I would call torture porn. And sure, it's gruesome. And it's very difficult for anybody to watch that and think there was no sacrifice involved. But I'm one of those people who can watch that and think that there's no sacrifice involved. And that's why we're here to talk about at the end of this. He then died, which doesn't seem possible for a God, but it specifically talks about him giving up the hope, which suggests that his spirit left his body because we buried his body. And then something happened that I wasn't taught about at all. As a young Southern Baptist, I was never taught about the harrowing of hell because by and large it doesn't exist in the Protestant Bible. There are two verses. One, I'm going to do a separate video about the harrowing of hell because it's a curiosity for me. I didn't even hear about it until I was an adult. There are two verses, one in 1 Peter and one in Ephesians, that have been interpreted by some as supporting this notion of Jesus descending into hell and preaching to the, and or liberating, depending on how you do it, the dead. But that's largely a Catholic doctrine. There's a number of other denominations that do it as well, but in the Catholic Protestant fighting, it's very few of the Protestant denominations spend any time going after a harrowing of hell. But that, as I said, is a separate video. And then about 1.5 to 3 days after he was killed, he was supposedly resurrected, depending on how you want to count the days. That's it. That's it. And Christians run around talking about how they're saved by the blood, washed in the blood, redeemed in the blood, blood. We're a blood-loving death cult. And if, like I mentioned, the torture porn in Passion of the Christ. But sacrifice means giving something up, something of value, something of substance, something that you don't want to get rid of. Like, if I give up something I never wanted, I've sacrificed nothing. And if I give up something even that's bad that I wanted, like I'm an ex-smoker, I gave up smoking at some point, that wouldn't be considered a sacrifice. It wasn't something that I wanted or that was good for me or anything else. I quit. I quit doing harm to my body in that sense. That's not a sacrifice. Sacrifice would be giving up, something else. I was sacrificing my money to the tobacco industry. But I was getting something in exchange for it. So even that doesn't really count as a sacrifice. And so I'm wondering, what was the sacrifice on Jesus' part? Because he was non-human and God before he came to earth. And he went back to being non-human and God after he came to earth, according to the stories. Then the only thing that he gave up was he gave up being non-human for about 33 years or so. The weekend of being tortured, while I'm sure was genuinely awful and painful, wasn't a sacrifice. There's nothing about that that's sacrificial. And while being a human may suck, he was still, at least doctrinally with most versions of Christianity, fully God the entire time. Fully man, fully God. Don't know how that works. Nobody does. It doesn't make any sense. It violates logic. But if Jesus began as non-human and God and ended as non-human and God, and at any point during there was also God, and the only thing that changed was he became human as well for a period of time, I don't really see how that's much of a sacrifice. Hey, I'm going to stop being non-human for a period of 33 years. Well, 33 years in the grand scheme of eternity is a vanishingly small amount. It's not even a fairly robust human life. Anybody who died at 33 would say they died too soon. But that's where our perspective on this sacrifice is abused. Because if we thought about dying at 33 after being tortured, we would consider that a sacrifice. We sacrificed the rest of whatever time we would have lived. And so we view it that way. But where's the sacrifice? Now, I've said before, and I mean it, although there's no way to prove it, if I could die right now and never be resurrected, and that would guarantee an end to poverty or hunger or war, I would happily do it. I would need proof that that's actually what's going to happen, and that's what keeps me from doing it. And everybody can say, oh, no, you wouldn't, no, you wouldn't, no, you wouldn't. Fine, your assessment of me is your assessment of me, but irrespective, at least I'm announcing that I would be willing to sacrifice myself if there was a guarantee of these things. There was no sacrifice here, and it supposedly was the most important thing ever because it guarantees your salvation. It guarantees your continued existence in a heaven, provided you adhere to whatever soteriological view is true. You got to get that one right. So where's the sacrifice? If Jesus existed, the story and the stories are true, he sacrificed nothing and gained nothing. He just went back to the way things were. He at most gave up earthly treasures, but since he didn't really do anything or contribute to anything in any of the stories here, maybe there weren't earthly treasures to give up, but if you're a God, what do you need of earthly treasures? And since the Bible already portrays earthly treasures as being like dirty rags, he went right back to being co-equal part of the Godhead / Trinity that he always was. So it seems that the only thing he could have possibly given up was being non-human for a period of a few years. That's something that somebody could view as a sacrifice. I sacrificed a few years being one of you. And that would be a legitimate sacrifice, except that he also didn't stop being God, which means it could have ended at any moment. In the Dark Knight trilogy at the beginning, Bruce Wayne gives up all of his money and goes and lives among the poor, among the criminals. He wants to learn about what it's like being, the dregs of society and everything else. He gives all that up. He gives up his entire fortune and goes off to do this. And yet at the end of the story, he comes back, or at some point in the story, he comes back and he gets all of his stuff back. He's back to being billionaire Bruce Wayne. He's all of his wealth and privilege are sitting there waiting for him the second he returns. At least in that case, Bruce gave something up because there was some risk. Like while he's off, yes, I know I'm comparing one fantasy creature or being to another. That's the way this should work. But if he's off living a life of poverty, but he can go back to being wealthy at any point that he wants to, the only real risk here is that Bruce isn't a god, which means if Bruce dies or ends up in prison or whatever, something prevents him from getting back to his wealth and privilege, then he will have actually sacrificed. And so that means that, he's constantly taking a risk. If Jesus was God before, and this was all preordained, and we knew he was going to God afterwards, then there's no risk, and there's no sacrifice, and there's no reason for him to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? There's no reason for him to say, if it be thy will, let this cup pass by me. None of those things make any sense if Jesus is God. None of those things make any sense if Jesus is going to go back to being just, God normally after the fact. There is no sacrifice. We can't demonstrate that the stories are true, that he existed, that any of this stuff ever happened at all. But even if it all happened and were true, there would be no sacrifice. This would all be posturing. It would be like you are the best player at a particular game, and you decide to pretend to lose a game to somebody who's new in order to boost their confidence. What did you sacrifice? Nothing. Things are the same now as they were before. The only difference is that you've declared those who accept this are now saved. But that means that you could have also come up with some other criteria. You could have come up with any criteria you wanted, or you could just say, I'm willing to forgive you without jumping through the hoops, without taking on human form and doing this absolute waste of a time effort. The story is absolutely preposterous. Jesus, even if the story was true, sacrificed nothing, and there's no reason to think that the story is true. And if the story is not true, then Jesus definitely sacrificed nothing. And yet, millions of people are wasting their life feeling guilty that they were so awful that God had to make this grand sacrifice. There wasn't a sacrifice. There wasn't anything of value in the story or the acts, even if they were true. It's all a ruse. See you next time.